The quickest way to lose control of yourself is to let someone else decide when you become angry. Provocation works because it compresses everything. Someone says one sentence, gives you one look, makes one dismissive gesture, and suddenly your body is already reacting before your mind has had time to decide what kind of person you want to be in that moment. Your breathing changes, your attention narrows, and the urge to answer becomes almost physical. What makes this dangerous is not simply that the other person may be disrespectful. It is that for a few seconds, they can influence your behavior by touching the right nerve. The Stoics understood that those few seconds matter. They were not trying to become emotionless, and they were not pretending that insult, disrespect, embarrassment, or anger could simply be switched off. Their concern was more practical. They wanted to know whether the first emotional impulse had to become the next action. That distinction is the heart of this episode, because when someone is trying to provoke you, the real question is not whether you feel something. You probably will. The real question is whether they get to decide what you do with that feeling. And this is where many people give away more power than they realize. They answer too quickly. They defend themselves before deciding whether the accusation deserves an answer. They match the other person's tone. They try to win the exchange. Then, hours later, when the situation is over, they are still replaying it and thinking of what they should have said. The provocation lasted 30 seconds, but its effect lasted half the day. We're going to look at how to interrupt that pattern, not with clever comebacks, not with fake indifference, and not by pretending you do not care. We'll look at how to recognize bait, how to slow the first emotional surge, how to respond without becoming passive, and how to leave the interaction without continuing it inside your own mind. If you find these conversations useful, like the video, share it with someone who deals with this kind of pressure, and subscribe for more practical discussions on Stoicism, emotional control, psychology, and self-mastery. Because before you can control your response, you need to recognize when someone is not really trying to communicate with you at all. They are simply trying to see whether they can make you react. One of the easiest mistakes to make in a tense interaction is assuming that every disagreement deserves the same kind of response. It doesn't. Sometimes someone is genuinely frustrated and trying to communicate. Sometimes they disagree with you and want to explain why. Sometimes they are clumsy, impatient, or emotionally charged, but there is still a real subject underneath the tension. And then there are moments when the subject barely matters at all, because what the other person really wants is a reaction. They want to see you become defensive, angry, embarrassed, or unsettled. If you cannot tell the difference between those two situations, you will waste enormous amounts of energy treating provocation like a problem that can be solved through better explanation. The difference usually reveals itself in what happens when you respond calmly to the actual issue. Imagine a coworker says, "I don't think you handled that well." You ask what specifically they think should have been done differently, and they give you an answer. You may dislike the criticism, but the conversation still has somewhere to go. There is information to evaluate. Now imagine you ask the same question and they respond with, "You always get defensive when someone points something out." Suddenly the discussion is no longer about what happened. It is about you. You explain that you are simply asking for clarification, and they say, "See, you always have to argue." The subject keeps moving because the original subject may never have been the point. The point was to place you in an emotional position and keep you there. That pattern matters more than trying to guess what is inside the other person's mind. We can become obsessed with determining whether someone is intentionally provoking us, but intention is often difficult to know. Some people provoke deliberately. Others have spent years communicating through sarcasm, accusation, humiliation, or emotional pressure, and may barely recognize what they are doing. You do not always need to solve that question. What matters is whether the interaction becomes clearer when you bring clarity to it. If you answer the actual point and the person immediately searches for another way to irritate you, that tells you something. If you remain calm and they increase the intensity rather than decrease it, that tells you something too. A person interested in resolution usually responds to resolution. A person interested in reaction often becomes frustrated when the reaction does not arrive. This is where Stoic thinking becomes useful, because it asks you to examine the first impression before obeying it. Someone says something disrespectful, and your mind immediately produces a conclusion. I have to answer that. Someone questions your competence in front of other people, and another thought appears. If I don't defend myself right now, everyone will think they are right. Someone makes a sarcastic comment about something personal, and the mind says, I need to show them they cannot speak to me that way. These thoughts arrive so quickly that they feel like instructions, but they are not instructions, they are impressions. You can notice them without immediately acting from them. A useful question in these situations is surprisingly simple. What exactly is this interaction asking me to do? Not what is being said on the surface, but what emotional role are you being invited into? Are you being invited to prove yourself? To become angry? To chase approval? To feel guilty enough to abandon a boundary? To say something reckless that can later be used against you? Once you notice the role, the interaction begins to look different. You are no longer only inside the conversation. Part of you is observing the structure of it. And that observation creates space. If someone says, you've become selfish, immediately after you tell them no, the accusation may feel like something you need to disprove. But perhaps the more important thing to notice is that the label appeared exactly when your boundary appeared. That does not automatically prove manipulation, but it changes the question. Instead of asking, how do I prove I'm not selfish? You can ask, is there actually anything here that requires a response? If there is, respond to it. If there is not, do not create a 20-minute defense around a sentence that was designed to pull you away from the original issue. The same principle applies to public provocation. Someone makes a cutting remark in front of other people because they know embarrassment increases the pressure to react. The audience makes the moment feel larger. You suddenly want to restore your position, show strength, or deliver the perfect comeback. But if you respond purely because you feel watched, the other person has already changed your behavior. Your response is no longer based on what the situation requires. It is based on what your ego fears other people might think. This is why recognizing bait is different from becoming passive. Sometimes a response is absolutely necessary. If someone makes a false claim that affects your work, correct it. If someone crosses an important boundary, address it. If someone is speaking disrespectfully in a context where silence would create real consequences, speak clearly. Stoicism is not about becoming a person who absorbs everything without resistance. It is about choosing resistance deliberately instead of being pushed into it automatically. And the more familiar you become with provocation, the less mysterious it feels. You start noticing repetition. The same accusation appears whenever you say no. The same joke appears whenever you seem confident. The same person becomes more aggressive whenever you refuse to explain yourself. Once a pattern becomes visible, it loses some of its power because you are no longer encountering it as a fresh emergency. You recognize it for what it is and respond according to what the moment actually needs. But recognition is only the first layer. You can know perfectly well that someone is baiting you and still feel the urge to answer immediately. The body does not become calm simply because the mind has identified the pattern. Anger can still rise. Embarrassment can still hit. The perfect comeback can still appear before you have had time to think. That is why the next skill matters so much, learning not to answer during the first emotional surge. There is a brief period after someone provokes you when almost everything inside you argues for speed. You want to answer before they can say anything else. You want to correct the accusation immediately, return the insult, explain what they misunderstood, or make sure everyone in the room knows you are not going to accept what was just said. In that moment, waiting can feel strangely unnatural, almost like surrender. But those first few seconds are often the worst possible time to decide what deserves to come out of your mouth, because the part of you that wants to respond most urgently is usually the part least interested in what happens 5 minutes later. This is not simply a philosophical problem. When we perceive social threat, the body can react before we have carefully interpreted what is happening. Heart rate can rise, muscles tighten, attention can narrow, and the mind becomes unusually sensitive to anything that looks like further disrespect. That response makes sense from a survival perspective. Human beings evolved in social groups where rejection, humiliation, and conflict could carry serious consequences. But the nervous system does not always distinguish elegantly between a genuine threat and a coworker making a sarcastic remark in a meeting. The intensity may be different, but the same basic machinery can begin moving. And once it does, the mind becomes very good at producing reasons why whatever we feel like doing right now is completely justified. This is where a small pause becomes more powerful than it appears. Not a theatrical silence designed to intimidate the other person, not counting slowly to 10 while pretending you are unaffected. Just enough time to prevent the first impulse from automatically becoming behavior. Maybe you take one breath before answering. Maybe you look at the person for a moment instead of immediately filling the space. Maybe you take a sip of water or glance back at whatever you were discussing. These are ordinary actions, but they create something important: distance between stimulus and response. The Stoics were deeply interested in that distance. They understood that the first impression is not always voluntary. Someone insults you and anger appears. Someone laughs at you and embarrassment arrives. Someone questions your integrity and you immediately feel the need to defend yourself. The mistake is believing that because the feeling arrived quickly, the action must follow quickly too. Epictetus repeatedly emphasized the need to examine impressions before giving them our agreement. In everyday language, that means allowing yourself to experience the first reaction without automatically treating it as the final truth about what is happening or the correct instruction for what to do next. Imagine someone says something deliberately disrespectful during a conversation. Your first thought may be, "I'm not letting them get away with that." Fair enough. But what does not letting them get away with it actually require? Does it require raising your voice? Does it require insulting them back? Does it require answering immediately? Or could it mean looking at them calmly and saying, "If you want to discuss this, speak to me respectfully"? The boundary can remain exactly as firm while the behavior expressing it becomes far more deliberate. This is one of the reasons emotional control should not be confused with suppressing emotion. Suppression says, "I shouldn't be angry." Control says, "I am angry, and I'm going to decide what this anger is useful for." Anger can contain information. It can tell you that something feels unfair, that a boundary may have been crossed, or that you need to pay closer attention. But information and instruction are not the same thing. A smoke alarm tells you to investigate. It does not tell you whether the building is actually burning or what route you should take out of it. The first emotional surge becomes especially dangerous when other people are watching. Public embarrassment adds another layer because now you are not only responding to the person, you are imagining the audience. You wonder whether silence will make you look weak, whether people agree with the insult, whether you need to restore your status immediately. The mind can construct an entire social emergency in seconds. And because you feel pressure to demonstrate strength, you may say something you would never have said in a private conversation. But strength does not always look fast. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is simply the one who does not allow the pace of someone else's aggression to become the pace of their own behavior. If they speak quickly, you can speak slowly. If they raise their voice, yours does not have to follow. If they demand an immediate answer, you can decide whether an immediate answer is appropriate. That change in tempo matters because provocation depends heavily on momentum. One remark produces another, then another, and soon both people are reacting to reactions rather than discussing anything meaningful. Slowing your side of the exchange interrupts that momentum. You are not controlling the other person. You are refusing to let their speed become yours. There is also a practical advantage to waiting. The first response your mind produces is often designed to relieve tension rather than improve the situation. The sarcastic comeback feels good because it releases pressure. Raising your voice feels powerful because it temporarily resolves the feeling of being challenged. Explaining yourself rapidly feels useful because it reduces the discomfort of being misunderstood. But relief and effectiveness are different things. A response can feel excellent for 3 seconds and create a problem that lasts 3 days. This is worth remembering when someone knows you well enough to understand your emotional habits. They may know that questioning your intelligence makes you argue. They may know that accusing you of being uncaring makes you explain yourself. They may know that ignoring you makes you chase clarification. If your first emotional impulse reliably determines your next action, anyone who understands the impulse can begin predicting the action. The pause breaks that predictability. You may still eventually respond exactly as firmly as you initially wanted to. The difference is that now the response belongs to you. You have examined the situation and chosen it. That is a very different experience from realizing afterward that someone pushed the right button and watched you perform the familiar reaction. And sometimes, after a few seconds, you discover that there is nothing worth saying at all. The remark that initially felt enormous begins to look small once the first wave passes. You realize that answering would only create a conversation you do not want, or you notice that the person is waiting for visible irritation, and the most sensible thing is simply to continue with what you were doing. Other times, the pause reveals that a response really is necessary, but now you can respond to the actual behavior rather than the emotional meaning your mind initially attached to it. Instead of, "Who do you think you are talking to?" you may say, "Don't speak to me that way." Instead of defending your entire character against an accusation, you ask, "What specifically are you referring to?" The response becomes smaller, clearer, and harder to distort. This is how composure develops in real life. Not by reaching a point where nobody can make your heart beat faster, but by becoming familiar with the space between feeling and action. At first, that space may be almost invisible. Later, you begin noticing it. Eventually, you can use it. And once you can create that space, something else becomes possible. Instead of immediately answering the insult, the sarcasm, or the vague accusation, you can make the other person do something they may not expect. Explain exactly what they mean. That shift from reacting to asking for clarity changes the entire structure of the interaction. A surprising amount of provocation depends on ambiguity. Someone does not directly say what they think, they imply it. They make a sarcastic comment and leave enough uncertainty to deny that it was meant badly. They ask a question that sounds innocent but carries an accusation underneath it. They make a joke at your expense and, if you object, tell you that you are taking things too seriously. This kind of communication is effective because it puts most of the work on you. You have to interpret what they meant, decide whether it was intentional, choose whether to respond, and then risk looking overly sensitive if you respond to something they can easily deny. That is why one of the most useful responses to indirect provocation is not a better insult or a clever comeback. It is clarity. Imagine someone looks at a piece of work you have done and says, "Well, I guess that's one way to do it." You can hear the judgment in the sentence. Your first impulse might be to defend the work or return the sarcasm, but neither response actually establishes what the person is saying. A calmer question does, "What do you mean?" Now the responsibility moves back toward them. If they have a legitimate criticism, they can state it. If they were simply trying to make you uncomfortable, they have to decide whether they are willing to turn the implication into an actual statement. This sounds almost too ordinary to be useful, but that is precisely its strength. You are not escalating. You are not pretending you did not notice. You are giving the person an opportunity to make their communication concrete. Sarcasm often becomes less comfortable when it has to explain itself. The same thing happens with jokes. Someone says something insulting in front of other people and then laughs. You could immediately become defensive, which may give them the reaction they wanted. Or you can calmly ask, "What's funny about that?" Not with hostility, not as a rehearsed psychological technique, but because the question is legitimate. If there is a joke, they can explain it. If the humor depended entirely on embarrassing you, explaining it may expose that more clearly than an angry response ever could. There is an important difference between this and interrogating someone. The purpose is not to trap them or make them look foolish. If you approach every ambiguous sentence with suspicious questions, ordinary conversation becomes exhausting. People speak imperfectly, humor misfires, tone gets misunderstood. Sometimes a strange comment really is just a strange comment. Clarity becomes useful when there is enough context to suggest that something important is hiding underneath the language. Perhaps the same person has made similar remarks repeatedly. Perhaps the comment appeared immediately after you established a boundary. Perhaps they are implying something about your competence, motives, or character, while refusing to say it directly. Instead of fighting with your interpretation, you give them room to state their position plainly. What exactly are you saying? Are you asking me something, or are you making a point? What specifically do you disagree with? Simple questions can do something that emotional reactions cannot. They slow the interaction down while keeping attention on the substance. And this connects directly to the pause we discussed earlier. Once you stop answering during the first emotional surge, you no longer need to solve the entire interaction instantly. You can become curious about what is actually happening. That curiosity is psychologically useful because anger narrows attention while curiosity tends to open it. Instead of thinking, "How dare they say that?" you begin asking, "What exactly was said? What do they actually want me to respond to?" The emotional temperature can change without you pretending the behavior is acceptable. Consider a workplace example. During a meeting, someone says, "Some of us actually care about getting this right." You immediately understand the implication. They are suggesting that someone else, perhaps you, does not care. The instinctive response might be, "Are you saying I don't care?" And depending on your tone, the conflict may already be escalating. But you can remove some of that emotional charge while preserving the question, "Is there something specific about my work that you think needs to change?" Now there is somewhere useful for the conversation to go. If they say yes and identify something concrete, you can discuss it. If they retreat and say, "I wasn't talking about you," then there may be nothing further to do. If they continue making vague personal comments without identifying an actual problem, the pattern becomes clearer. You have not won anything. You have simply stopped participating in ambiguity. This matters because difficult people can sometimes keep us emotionally occupied through implication alone. We spend hours thinking about what they really meant. We tell someone else about the comment and ask what they think it meant. We replay the expression on the person's face. We construct motives and explanations. Meanwhile, the person who made the remark may have spent 30 seconds thinking about it. Clarity protects you from doing all of that interpretive labor. Either something concrete emerges or it does not. This also applies when someone makes broad accusations. "You've changed. You're selfish. You always make everything about yourself." These statements can provoke long defenses because they attack identity rather than behavior. You may start listing examples from the last 5 years to prove that you are not selfish, but what happens if you ask, "What specifically did I do?" Now the conversation has to move from identity toward behavior. Maybe they have a legitimate example. If so, listen. Being emotionally controlled does not mean assuming every criticism is manipulation. Sometimes difficult feedback contains something we need to hear. But if they cannot identify anything specific and simply repeat the label, you learn something important. There may be no concrete issue available to solve. This is where Stoic self-command protects us from two opposite mistakes. One is accepting every accusation because someone expressed it confidently. The other is rejecting every accusation because we dislike the person who expressed it. Neither approach requires much wisdom. The better question is whether there is truth here that deserves our attention. If there is, take it seriously. If there is not, you do not need to spend the rest of the afternoon disproving it. And asking for clarity can help you find out which situation you are in. There is another benefit that is easy to miss. When you ask someone to explain themselves, you give yourself more time. They are speaking while you are listening. Your first emotional reaction has another few seconds to settle. You can observe their answer rather than preparing your attack. The conversation becomes less reflexive. This does not guarantee that the other person will become reasonable. They may become more aggressive when asked to be specific. They may accuse you of pretending not to understand. They may simply repeat themselves louder. That response is information too. You cannot force someone into a productive conversation merely by asking good questions. Clarity is an invitation, not magic. But once the invitation has been refused repeatedly, you no longer need to keep pretending that better explanation from you will solve the problem. Sometimes the most important clarity is the clarity you gain about the conversation itself. There is nothing here to resolve, and that realization can save enormous amounts of energy. But even when you have slowed the interaction and made the issue explicit, another pressure remains. Human beings naturally mirror one another. Someone becomes louder, and our voice begins rising. They become sarcastic, and suddenly sarcasm feels like the appropriate language. They show contempt, and we feel an urge to return it. Without noticing, we can begin allowing another person's behavior to decide the version of ourselves that enters the conversation. That is why the next step goes deeper than choosing the right words. It is learning not to let their tone choose yours. There is something almost automatic about emotional imitation. Someone speaks to us sharply, and our voice becomes sharper. They become impatient, and we begin speaking faster. They use sarcasm, and suddenly sarcasm feels like the most natural language available to us. Even when we entered the conversation calm, a few minutes later we can find ourselves behaving in ways that look remarkably similar to the person who irritated us. Then, after the interaction ends, we sometimes feel a second kind of frustration. We are not only angry at what they did, we are disappointed that they managed to pull us into behaving in a way that does not feel like us. This is one of the less obvious forms of emotional control. Another person does not need to convince you of anything or force you to do something dramatic. If their tone can reliably determine your tone, they are already influencing your behavior. They become aggressive, so you become aggressive. They become dismissive, so you become cold. They mock you, so you search for something equally painful to say back. The interaction begins to operate like a mirror, with each person reflecting the worst part of the other. And because each reaction feels justified by what came immediately before it, both people can leave believing the other person caused everything. The difficult part is that matching someone's energy can feel like strength in the moment. If someone raises their voice, speaking softly may feel submissive. If they disrespect you publicly, responding calmly may feel as though you are allowing the disrespect to stand. There is a strong social instinct to show that we cannot be intimidated, And sometimes that instinct tells us that the only convincing way to demonstrate strength is to become equally intense. But intensity and strength are not the same thing. You can be extremely loud while having almost no control over yourself. You can also be completely calm while making a decision the other person does not like at all. The Stoics were concerned with this distinction because character, for them, was not something that should change according to whoever happened to be standing in front of you. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that another person's bad behavior was not a reason to abandon his own standards. That sounds morally admirable in theory, but in ordinary life it is much more practical than moralistic. If every rude person can make you rude, every angry person can make you angry, and every petty person can make you petty, then your character becomes remarkably easy for strangers to edit. That does not mean you should use the same tone in every situation. Human communication requires flexibility. Sometimes warmth is appropriate, sometimes firmness is necessary, sometimes someone genuinely needs to hear that you are serious. The point is not to develop one permanently calm voice and use it mechanically regardless of context. The point is that your tone should come from what the situation requires, not from an unconscious need to mirror whatever the other person is giving you. Imagine someone begins speaking loudly during a disagreement. You notice your own voice starting to rise. There is a small choice available there. You can continue following their volume, or you can return to your normal pace and say what you actually need to say. Perhaps you tell them, "I'm willing to discuss this, but I'm not going to shout about it." If they continue shouting, you may end the conversation. None of that is passive. You have not surrendered the issue. You have simply refused to accept the idea that their emotional state gets to establish the rules of communication. The same thing applies to sarcasm. Sarcasm is tempting because it allows aggression to feel intelligent. Someone makes a cutting remark and, within seconds, the mind produces an even better one. You can almost feel the satisfaction of saying it. And sometimes the comeback really would be clever. But there is a more useful question than whether the sentence is clever. What happens after you say it? Usually, the other person does not suddenly become thoughtful. They answer. Then you answer. The original problem disappears beneath a competition neither person intended to enter 5 minutes earlier. This is why controlling tone is not about appearing morally superior. It is about refusing unnecessary escalation. If there is an actual problem to solve, sarcasm usually makes that problem harder to solve. If there is no problem to solve and the person is simply provoking you, sarcasm gives the provocation somewhere to continue. Either way, you may be paying for a few seconds of satisfaction with much more of your time. There is also a physical component to this that deserves attention. Tone is not created only in the voice. It begins in the body. When we feel threatened or challenged, we may lean forward, tighten our face, speak faster, interrupt more often, or reduce the space between ourselves and the other person. Those changes can occur before we consciously decide to become confrontational. Then the other person sees our body and reacts to it, which increases our reaction, and the feedback loop strengthens. Sometimes changing one physical behavior interrupts the loop. Sit back instead of leaning forward. Let the other person finish the sentence. Lower your speaking speed rather than trying to lower your anger directly. You are not performing relaxation. You are giving your nervous system fewer signals that a battle is underway. This is particularly useful when dealing with someone who seems to become more animated as you become more animated. We have all seen conversations where neither person is discussing the original issue anymore. They are responding to volume, facial expressions, interruptions, and perceived disrespect. The emotional form of the conversation has replaced its content. At that point, winning becomes almost meaningless. Even if you prove your point, what exactly have you won if you had to become someone you dislike in order to prove it? This is where Stoic self-respect becomes more demanding than ordinary pride. Pride says, "I cannot let them speak to me like that." Self-respect asks, what response allows me to protect my boundary without surrendering control of my own conduct? Sometimes the answer is direct confrontation. Sometimes it is a calm correction. Sometimes it is leaving. What matters is that you choose rather than imitate. And there will be moments when you fail at this. Someone will catch you at the wrong time. You will answer too sharply. You will match the sarcasm and regret it later. The useful response is not to create another identity problem and tell yourself you have no emotional control. Look at what happened. Where did the shift begin? Was it the accusation, the volume, being interrupted, feeling embarrassed in front of someone else? Then you know where the next moment of choice is likely to appear. This is how emotional control becomes practical rather than idealized. You become increasingly familiar with the exact point where another person's behavior begins changing yours. Once you can see that point, you can intervene earlier. And over time, something interesting happens. People may remain unpredictable around you, but you become more predictable to yourself. You know that another person's anger does not automatically require yours. Their contempt does not require contempt. Their urgency does not require you to rush. Their emotional state becomes information about them rather than an instruction for you. That creates a very different kind of confidence. You no longer need the room to be calm before you can remain grounded inside it. But there is another temptation that survives even after you learn to control your tone. You may remain perfectly calm and still become completely invested in defeating the person intellectually. You want the final word. You want them to realize they were wrong. You want everyone watching to know who won. And once winning becomes the goal, provocation has found another way to keep you engaged. There is a point in many tense conversations where the original issue quietly disappears and something else takes its place, the need to win. You may not announce it to yourself that way. It can feel more respectable than that. You tell yourself you are defending the truth, protecting your dignity, correcting the record, making sure the other person understands what they did. But underneath all of that, another motive can begin taking over. You want the last word. You want them to admit they were wrong. You want the people watching to see that you handled them better than they handled you. And once that becomes the goal, the conversation changes. You are no longer deciding whether the interaction is useful. You are deciding how to defeat someone who has already succeeded in making the exchange emotionally important to you. This is one reason provocation can be so effective, even when you remain outwardly calm. You may control your voice perfectly, avoid raising your tone, and still be deeply hooked by the need to prove something. The person says something foolish, and now you feel compelled to expose the contradiction. They make an unfair accusation, and you begin assembling evidence. They misunderstand your position, and instead of asking whether their understanding actually matters, you become determined to correct it. The argument can remain polite on the surface while consuming just as much energy underneath. Emotional control is not only about looking calm, it is also about noticing when your attention has become trapped inside a contest that no longer deserves it. The Stoic perspective becomes useful here because it keeps returning to purpose. What are you actually trying to accomplish in this conversation? If the goal is to solve a practical problem, then anything that helps solve it has value. If the goal is to correct a factual error that matters, correct it. If someone has crossed a boundary, state the boundary clearly. But if the goal has shifted toward making the other person feel defeated, embarrassed, exposed, or intellectually inferior, then you are no longer simply responding to the situation. You are reacting to your own need for victory. That need can be extremely seductive because winning feels like closure. We imagine that if we can just say the right thing, the tension will disappear. The other person will finally understand. Perhaps they will go quiet, perhaps they will realize they underestimated us. But difficult people rarely provide that kind of ending. If you make one strong point, they introduce another. If you correct one claim, they move to a different one. If they cannot challenge the content, they challenge your tone. And because you are now invested in winning, every new move keeps you in the exchange. This is how a 5-minute disagreement becomes 40 minutes. You are no longer talking because anything important remains unresolved. You are talking because neither person wants to be the first one to stop. There is something revealing in that. If ending the conversation feels like losing, then the conversation has probably become a competition. And once you notice that, another option appears. You can stop participating without deciding who won. That can be harder than it sounds. The ego strongly dislikes unfinished contests. It wants a visible conclusion. It wants a clear score. If someone walks away still convinced that they were right, part of you may feel that you allowed something to happen. But what exactly happened? They retained an opinion. They may even tell themselves they won. That thought exists inside their mind, and unless it creates real consequences, it may deserve far less importance than your ego assigns to it. There is a difference between being correct and being recognized as correct. The first may matter. The second often matters much less than we think. Imagine someone at work makes an inaccurate criticism of your contribution. If the issue affects a decision, record, or evaluation, correct the facts clearly. That is not about winning, it is about protecting something concrete. But once the necessary correction is made, continuing the argument simply because the other person refuses to concede may have no practical value. You can know the facts are documented and still allow them to remain unconvinced. That requires a different kind of confidence. You stop treating agreement as proof that your position is valid. You stop treating disagreement as proof that your explanation failed. And you begin accepting something emotionally mature people eventually have to accept. Sometimes two people leave the same conversation believing different things. Life continues. The same principle matters in personal relationships. Someone may accuse you of being selfish because you said no. You explain your decision once. They reject the explanation. At that point, you can spend another hour defending your character, or allow the disagreement to remain. If you know the boundary is reasonable and you have examined your own motives honestly, what exactly are you trying to win after that? Their approval? Their admission? Their surrender? If the answer is yes, then the conflict may now be doing more work inside you than the original issue ever did. This does not mean becoming intellectually lazy or refusing meaningful disagreement. Good arguments can sharpen thought. Honest debate can expose blind spots. The Stoics themselves argued about ideas, ethics, politics, and human behavior, but productive disagreement has a different texture from emotional competition. In a productive exchange, you are willing to discover that you are wrong. In a contest, being wrong feels unacceptable because your identity has entered the room. That is another useful test. Can you still listen? If the other person suddenly makes a valid point, can you acknowledge it? Can you say, "You're right about that part," without feeling that you have surrendered the entire conversation? If not, perhaps you are no longer seeking clarity. You are protecting status. And status anxiety is one of the reasons public provocation feels so powerful. When others are watching, the urge to win intensifies because the disagreement no longer feels private. Now it seems connected to how everyone sees you. You imagine that silence looks weak, that backing down looks humiliating, that failing to answer immediately means the other person has established dominance. But people often remember composure more than cleverness. The person who stays focused on what matters, refuses unnecessary escalation, and does not turn every disagreement into a performance, may appear far more secure than the person who needs to win every exchange. And more importantly, You have to ask who you are performing for. If your behavior changes dramatically because there is an audience, then the audience has joined the provocation. Now you are reacting not only to the person, but to your imagination of everyone else's judgment. The Stoic alternative is to return to your own standard. Was I accurate? Was I fair? Was I clear? Did I protect what needed protection? Did I remain aligned with the kind of person I want to be? If the answer is yes, the conversation does not need a trophy. You can leave without a final line. You can let someone else believe they had the last word. You can even allow them to feel satisfied. None of that changes your character, your facts, or your decisions. And this becomes particularly useful when dealing with people who use endless conversation as a way to exhaust you. If they discover that you need to win, they can keep you engaged almost indefinitely. Every new accusation becomes another round. Every distorted statement becomes another invitation. Your need for resolution becomes the very thing that prevents resolution. The moment you stop needing victory, however, their ability to extend the exchange weakens. You begin saying what is necessary and no more. You correct what matters and leave the rest. You stop producing long explanations for someone who has already shown they are not interested in understanding them. And once winning is no longer the objective, language itself begins to change. Responses become shorter, cleaner, less defensive. There is less material for someone else to grab, reinterpret, and throw back at you. That is where the next skill becomes practical, because when someone is trying to draw more emotion, more explanation, and more conflict out of you, sometimes the most effective adjustment is not finding better words. It is using fewer of them. The more emotionally charged a conversation becomes, the more tempting it is to explain yourself in detail. You want to make sure nothing can be misunderstood. You want to close every possible loophole in the other person's argument. You want to prove that your intention was reasonable, that your memory is accurate, that your decision makes sense, so you keep adding words. Another sentence, another example, another explanation. But with someone who is trying to provoke you, more words often create more surfaces they can push against. Every sentence gives them something new to question, distort, interrupt, or reinterpret. What begins as an attempt to create clarity can turn into a maze where you are constantly responding to the latest version of a conflict that should have ended 20 minutes ago. This is one reason emotionally controlled communication often sounds simpler than emotionally reactive communication. When you are calm, you are usually clearer about what actually needs to be said. You do not need to defend every part of your identity. You do not need to explain the history of the relationship. You do not need to answer every accusation attached to the current issue. You can stay with the relevant point. If someone says, "You never care about anyone but yourself," after you decline a request, you do not necessarily need to produce a list of everything generous you have done in the last 5 years. You may simply say, "I'm still not able to do that." The accusation does not automatically deserve a second conversation. This can feel uncomfortable because short responses sometimes feel incomplete. We are used to thinking that if we explain enough, the other person will finally understand us correctly. But that assumption only works when the other person is trying to understand. If they are trying to provoke, dominate, or keep you emotionally engaged, explanation may become fuel. You clarify one point, and they move to another. You answer the new point, and they reinterpret your answer. Soon you are no longer speaking because communication requires it. You are speaking because silence feels dangerous. The Stoic discipline here is not about becoming cold or robotic. It is about refusing to confuse quantity with truth. A true statement does not become more true because you repeat it 6 times. A reasonable boundary does not become more reasonable because you attach 3 paragraphs of justification to it. Sometimes the extra language is not helping the other person understand you. It is helping you manage your own discomfort with being misunderstood. That distinction matters. Suppose someone asks why you are not attending an event. You answer, "I can't make it this time." They push, "Why not?" You give a brief explanation. Then they challenge the explanation. At that point, you have a choice. You can keep presenting evidence until they approve of your reason, or you can recognize that the decision has already been communicated. The conversation may no longer be about information. It may be about whether they can pressure you into changing your answer. Fewer words protect the decision from becoming a debate. "I understand you're disappointed. I still can't make it." That may be enough. And the power of this approach is not in the exact wording. In fact, memorizing clever phrases can create another problem because you begin treating every interaction like a script. The deeper skill is learning to recognize when the useful part of the conversation has ended. Once the necessary information has been exchanged, what are the additional words doing? Are they solving something? Are they adding relevant information? Or are they simply keeping you emotionally involved? That question can save you from a surprising amount of unnecessary conflict. This becomes even more important when the person uses your emotional explanations against you. Perhaps you tell them that their behavior hurt you, and instead of listening, they begin debating whether you are entitled to feel hurt. Now you explain why it hurt. They argue with your explanation. You give another example. The conversation slowly shifts from their behavior to whether your emotional reaction is valid. You do not always need to participate in that shift. You can say, "I've told you how I see it," and stop. Not because feelings are beyond discussion, but because there is a point where discussion becomes an attempt to obtain permission for your own experience. The same principle applies to criticism. If someone says, "You handled that badly," and there is something specific to examine, ask for specifics. But if they continue repeating vague judgments, you do not need to respond to every variation. "I understand that's your opinion," may sound almost too simple, but sometimes simplicity is exactly what prevents the interaction from expanding. There is another reason fewer words help. They make your own thinking easier to observe. When you are producing long explanations under pressure, you can lose track of what you actually believe. You start adding sentences just to respond to the other person's latest objection. Eventually, you may say something you do not mean simply because you are trying to survive the conversational momentum. Shorter responses force you to ask, what is the essential point? Maybe the essential point is, "I disagree." Maybe it is, "That did not happen." Maybe it is, "I'm not discussing this." Maybe it is, "I'll think about what you said." Each of these leaves space around the statement. And that space matters because provocation often depends on getting you to fill every silence with more emotional material. This does not mean that serious conversations should be reduced to one-line answers. Important relationships sometimes require long explanations, patience, vulnerability, and detail. If someone you trust is genuinely trying to understand you, giving them context can strengthen the relationship. The question is not whether long explanations are bad. The question is whether they are being offered into a conversation capable of receiving them. That difference changes everything. A safe person may ask a difficult question because they want to understand you better. A provocative person may ask the same question because they want an emotional opening. The words can look similar while the interaction feels completely different. And again, patterns matter. Does the person become clearer when you explain, or simply generate more conflict? Do they respond to what you actually said, or constantly shift the subject? Do your explanations move the conversation forward, or only make it longer? If nothing changes except your level of exhaustion, more explanation is probably not the solution. There is a kind of confidence in learning to stop at enough. You stop assuming that every misunderstanding must be corrected immediately. You stop trying to close every gap in someone else's interpretation. You let your words carry only the weight they need to carry. And that restraint becomes especially important when the next pressure arrives, because once someone realizes they cannot pull endless explanations out of you, they may try something stronger, an accusation that makes you feel you have no choice but to defend yourself. That is where the next part begins. An accusation can change the entire direction of a conversation in a few seconds because it creates an immediate psychological burden. Now you feel that you have something to prove. You may have entered the interaction discussing a simple decision, a disagreement, or a boundary, and suddenly someone says, "You're selfish, you're jealous, you always make everything difficult, or you clearly don't care." The original subject begins disappearing because your attention moves toward defending your character. You start explaining what you meant, reminding them of things you have done, searching for examples that contradict what they said. And before you realize it, you are no longer discussing the decision that started the conversation. You are standing in an imaginary courtroom trying to convince another person that their interpretation of you is wrong. This is one of the reasons accusations are so effective during provocation. They do not merely challenge what you did, they can challenge who you believe yourself to be. If someone says, "I disagree with your decision," you can discuss the decision. If they say, "You made that decision because you only care about yourself," the conversation has moved into your motives and identity. Now the natural instinct is to prove that you are not the person they have described. And if being seen as selfish, weak, dishonest, incompetent, or uncaring touches something particularly sensitive in you, the urge to defend yourself becomes even stronger. But an accusation is not automatically a question that requires an answer. Sometimes it contains useful information. Sometimes someone is telling you something difficult that you genuinely need to hear. Emotional control should never become a method for dismissing criticism simply because criticism is uncomfortable. If several people you respect independently tell you that you interrupt constantly, become defensive when corrected, or fail to consider other people's needs, it would be foolish to hide behind Stoicism and decide that their opinions are outside your control. Character requires self-examination too. The challenge is learning to examine criticism without immediately entering a defensive performance. A useful distinction is between a specific claim and a global judgment. "You said you would send this yesterday, and you didn't," gives you something concrete to examine. Either you did or you did not. "You're completely unreliable" takes one or more events and turns them into an identity. The first statement may require accountability. The second may tempt you into defending your entire history. If you are not careful, you can spend 20 minutes proving that you are generally reliable while never addressing the missed deadline that actually mattered. The opposite can happen too. A person may use a global accusation precisely because the concrete issue does not support the pressure they want to create. You tell someone that you cannot help them this weekend, and they say, "You never care about anyone but yourself." If you accept the structure of that accusation, you are now required to demonstrate that you care. You list previous occasions when you helped them. You explain why this weekend is different. You reassure them that the relationship matters. The more you explain, the further you move from the simple fact that you are unavailable. And notice what can happen if this pattern repeats. Eventually, the accusation itself becomes enough to change your behavior. They do not need to persuade you, they only need to call you selfish, and you begin reconsidering your boundary because you cannot tolerate being seen that way. That is emotional leverage. The Stoic response is not to become indifferent to your character. It is almost the opposite. You become serious enough about your character that you stop outsourcing its definition to whoever happens to be upset with you. Marcus Aurelius was deeply concerned with living honorably, but reputation and character were not identical to him. Other people could misunderstand him, criticize him, or attribute motives to him that were not his own. His responsibility was to examine his conduct honestly and correct what deserved correction. He could not force everyone else to reach the correct conclusion. That gives us a much more stable way to deal with accusations. Instead of immediately asking, "How do I prove them wrong?" ask, "Is there anything true here that I need to deal with?" That question changes your position completely. You are no longer the defendant. You are the examiner. Maybe the answer is yes. Perhaps you did behave selfishly in that particular situation. Then you can acknowledge it without collapsing into the larger identity the person assigned to you. "You're right, I should have considered that." There is tremendous strength in an honest admission because you no longer need to protect an image of yourself as someone who never makes mistakes. But perhaps you examine the accusation and find that it is vague, exaggerated, or simply designed to provoke guilt. Then you do not have to build a case against it. You can let it remain their judgment. This is difficult because we often believe silence means agreement. If someone calls you arrogant and you do not defend yourself, perhaps they will think you accept the accusation. Perhaps other people will think so too. But silence does not contain one universal meaning. Sometimes silence means there is nothing useful to add. Sometimes it means the accusation is too vague to engage with. Sometimes it means you have already answered and are unwilling to repeat yourself. And sometimes you do respond, but you respond to the specific issue rather than the identity attack. You're selfish. I understand you're upset that I said no. My answer is still no. You never listen to anyone. If there's something specific you think I missed, tell me. You only did that because you wanted attention. You're free to interpret my motive that way. The value of these responses is not that they are magical phrases. They are useful because they refuse the hidden assignment inside the accusation. You do not automatically begin proving that you are good, reasonable, caring, or intelligent simply because someone has questioned it. This becomes especially important with people who repeatedly tell you what you really think or feel. You explain your intention, and they respond, "No, that's not why you did it." You clarify again. They insist they understand your motives better than you do. Now you are in an impossible conversation because you are trying to prove the contents of your own mind to someone who has already decided not to accept your description. There is a point where explanation stops being communication and becomes pleading for permission to define your own experience. You do not have to stay there. You can say what your intention was once. If the situation has serious consequences, provide whatever facts are relevant. But you cannot force another person to believe you, and repeating yourself 10 times does not increase your control over their conclusion. This is where the earlier practices begin working together. You recognize the provocation. You allow the first emotional surge to pass. You ask for clarity when the accusation is vague. You refuse to mirror the other person's tone. You stop trying to win. You use fewer words. Each step reduces the amount of emotional material available for the conflict to consume. And slowly, something shifts inside you. Being accused no longer automatically feels like being summoned. Someone can have a judgment about you without that judgment immediately becoming your task. That does not make you careless about how you affect others. If anything, it can make self-reflection more honest because you are no longer examining yourself under the panic of needing to prove innocence. You can ask whether you were wrong without believing that being wrong destroys your identity. You can apologize when an apology is deserved and decline to apologize when it is not. There is a quiet stability in that. But accusations are only one way provocation reaches us. Even when you know what not to say, your body may reveal everything before you speak. Your face tightens, your breathing changes, you begin interrupting, your voice speeds up. The other person can see the reaction forming before you have decided what to do with it. And that is why emotional control has to move one level deeper. Before you manage the sentence, you need to notice what your face, voice, and body are already doing. We tend to think emotional control begins with choosing the right sentence, but by the time the sentence arrives, the conversation may already have changed. Your face tightened when the comment was made. Your shoulders moved forward. Your breathing became shallow. You started speaking slightly faster, perhaps a little louder. Maybe you interrupted before the other person finished because you already knew what you wanted to say. None of these reactions necessarily feel significant from inside your own body, but together they communicate something very clearly. The provocation has reached you, and once the other person sees that reaction, their behavior may change in response to yours. They become more animated, you become more defensive, and within seconds both people are reacting to signals that appeared before either of them consciously decided to escalate anything. This is why learning to manage yourself physically is not about looking emotionless. Trying to keep a perfectly blank face while anger is moving through you can become another performance, and performances keep your attention fixed on how the other person perceives you. You start wondering whether you look calm enough, whether they can tell you are irritated, whether your silence is making the right impression. That is still a form of preoccupation with them. The more useful goal is simpler. Do not let the body accelerate the situation faster than your mind can understand it. You may look annoyed because you are annoyed. That is not a failure. What matters is whether the physical reaction begins deciding what happens next. The body is often the first place where you can catch the shift. You may notice your jaw tightening before you have consciously identified anger. You may feel heat in your face, pressure in your chest, or the urge to lean toward the person. Perhaps your speech becomes faster whenever you feel misunderstood. Maybe you stop breathing naturally when someone criticizes you, then release everything in a long defensive explanation. These reactions are worth learning because they give you an earlier point of intervention. Instead of waiting until you are halfway through saying something you will regret, you can notice the body preparing to say it. There is nothing mystical required here. Sometimes the most useful adjustment is simply slowing down one physical behavior. If your speech is accelerating, deliberately return to your normal pace. If you are leaning forward aggressively, sit back. If you keep interrupting, allow the person to finish even when you strongly disagree with what they are saying. If your breathing has become shallow, let yourself take one ordinary, complete breath before answering. The purpose is not relaxation for its own sake. You are changing the physical tempo of the interaction so that emotion has less momentum. This matters because the nervous system responds not only to what is happening around us, but also to what our own body is doing. When we speak rapidly, tighten our muscles, and prepare ourselves physically for confrontation, the situation can begin feeling even more threatening. Then the increased sense of threat produces more tension, which produces more urgency. It becomes a loop. You may think you are physically tense because the argument is escalating, while part of the escalation is being maintained by the tension itself. Slowing one part of that loop can create enough room for judgment to return. Imagine someone makes a humiliating comment about you in front of several people. You feel the immediate rush we discussed earlier. Your first instinct is to turn toward them quickly and answer with equal force. But instead of focusing first on what sentence you should use, notice what your body wants to do. It wants speed. It wants confrontation. It wants to close the distance between offense and retaliation. If you resist only that speed, the entire situation can begin to look different. You turn normally. You let the silence exist for a moment. You ask, "What do you mean by that?" Or, if the disrespect is obvious, "Don't speak to me like that." The words are almost secondary. What gives them weight is that they are not being carried by panic. There is a common misconception that calm physical behavior communicates weakness, especially when another person is aggressive. Sometimes people believe they need to appear visibly angry so the other person understands that a boundary has been crossed. But anger is only one way of communicating seriousness. Consistency is another. Consequences are another. Leaving is another. A quiet refusal can be far more serious than an emotional threat you will never enforce. Think about the difference between someone shouting, "I swear, if you speak to me like that again, I'm done," and someone saying calmly, "If this continues, I'm leaving," then actually leaving when it continues. One contains more visible emotion, the other contains more control. This is where Stoic discipline becomes concrete. The Stoics understood that we cannot always prevent the body from registering the first shock of an event. Even a trained person may startle, tense, or feel fear. The important distinction is between the involuntary beginning of an emotion and everything we add afterward. You do not need to judge yourself because your heart beat faster when someone confronted you. You need to become familiar enough with that response that it does not immediately become your master. And familiarity comes through observation. After a difficult interaction, instead of only analyzing what you said, ask what happened physically before you said it. Did you start talking faster? Did you stop listening? Did your volume rise without you noticing? Did you begin making larger gestures? Did you move closer? Did you feel compelled to fill every silence? Those details can reveal your personal pattern of escalation. Once you know the pattern, you can recognize its beginning. This is especially valuable with people you deal with repeatedly because the body learns associations. If someone has embarrassed or attacked you several times, you may become physically alert simply when they enter the room. Nothing has happened yet, but your system remembers. You may start monitoring their expression, preparing responses, and interpreting neutral behavior through the history between you. By the time they actually speak, you are already halfway toward confrontation. That does not mean the history is imaginary. Your caution may be completely justified, but physical readiness and useful preparation are different things. You can know someone tends to provoke you without spending the entire interaction physically preparing for a fight. This is where posture can become almost philosophical, not in the sense of standing in some artificial position that supposedly creates confidence, but in the simple act of inhabiting your own space without either shrinking or advancing. You do not need to make yourself smaller because someone is aggressive. You also do not need to become physically larger to demonstrate that you cannot be intimidated. You remain where you are and deal with what is actually happening. Your voice works the same way. A steady voice does not need to be unusually low or slow. Trying to sound intimidating can become another reaction to the person. Use your normal voice. Say what needs to be said clearly. If the environment is loud, speak loudly enough to be heard. If firmness is required, be firm. The goal is not a particular sound. It is maintaining enough control that your voice expresses your decision rather than merely broadcasting your nervous system. And there will be situations where you cannot maintain that control perfectly. Your voice may shake. Your face may reveal that you are hurt. You may feel visibly nervous while setting a boundary. None of that invalidates the boundary. Emotional control is not measured by whether another person can detect that you have emotions. Sometimes courage looks exactly like a shaking voice, saying something that still needs to be said. This is important because trying to hide every sign of emotion can create shame around normal human reactions. You do not need to become unreadable. You need to remain capable of choosing. That is the deeper pattern running through everything we have discussed. The person provokes you, and instead of immediately becoming the reaction, you keep returning to choice. You choose whether the comment deserves meaning. You choose whether the accusation deserves an answer. You choose your tone. You choose how much language the situation requires. And now you begin learning to keep your body from making those choices before you do. But this raises a question that cannot be avoided forever. If we become good at slowing ourselves down, using fewer words, and refusing unnecessary conflict, could we start ignoring things that actually need to be confronted? Silence can be wise, but silence can also become avoidance. Some provocations are trivial. Others reveal disrespect, harassment, or behavior that has real consequences. The next step is learning how to tell the difference. There is a mistake we can make once we become interested in emotional control. We start treating silence as the correct response to everything. Someone insults us, we ignore it. Someone crosses a boundary, we tell ourselves not to react. Someone repeatedly behaves disrespectfully, and we convince ourselves that the most stoic thing to do is remain unaffected. At first, this can feel like discipline because we are no longer being pulled into every conflict. But there is an important difference between refusing unnecessary provocation and becoming passive in situations that genuinely require action. Stoicism was never about allowing other people to behave however they want, while we quietly absorb the consequences. The challenge is not learning how to respond less, it is learning how to respond more selectively. That distinction becomes easier when you stop asking whether something bothered you and begin asking what the behavior actually changes. A stranger makes a rude comment as you walk past them, and perhaps there is nothing useful to accomplish by turning around. Someone online deliberately misunderstands something you said, and answering may simply create another hour of meaningless argument. A coworker makes one awkward joke, realizes it landed badly, and moves on. Not every unpleasant moment needs to become an event. Sometimes the most intelligent response is to allow something small to remain small. But imagine the same coworker repeatedly humiliates you in meetings, undermines your work, or makes false claims that affect how others evaluate your performance. Now the situation is different. Silence may no longer protect your peace. It may allow a harmful pattern to continue. You might need to correct the record, document what happened, speak privately with the person, involve a manager, or use whatever formal process is appropriate. None of those actions requires rage. In fact, the calmer you are, the easier it may be to distinguish the actual problem from the emotional noise surrounding it. This is why the question, "Should I respond?" is usually too simple. A better question is, what does this situation require? Sometimes it requires nothing. Sometimes it requires one sentence. Sometimes it requires a boundary. Sometimes it requires documentation and action long after the conversation has ended. That range matters because we often imagine only two options, react or ignore. But mature emotional control creates many more possibilities between those extremes. Suppose a relative makes a provocative comment about the way you live. You know from experience that arguing will lead nowhere. The opinion has no practical authority over your life. Perhaps there is no reason to do anything beyond saying, "We see that differently," and continuing with the evening. Now imagine that the same relative repeatedly discusses private information you asked them not to share. The problem is no longer merely an irritating opinion. There is a behavioral pattern affecting your privacy. You may need to stop giving them certain information, confront the behavior directly, or change how much access they have to your personal life. The response should be proportional to the consequence. That principle sounds obvious, but emotion tends to distort proportion in both directions. When we are angry, small things can feel enormous. A dismissive look becomes an insult that must be answered. A sarcastic sentence feels like a challenge to our dignity. We react strongly because the immediate feeling is strong. Fear can distort proportion in the opposite direction. Something genuinely important happens, but we minimize it because confrontation makes us uncomfortable. We tell ourselves to let it go when what we really mean is that we are afraid of what might happen if we address it. So the intensity of your emotion cannot be the only measure. You need another standard. Ask whether the behavior has consequences beyond the moment. Does it affect your work, reputation, responsibilities, safety, important relationships, or ability to function in the environment? Is it a repeated pattern or an isolated incident? Does remaining silent communicate something you do not intend to communicate? Is there a reasonable action available that could improve the situation? These questions move you away from wounded pride and toward judgment. And wounded pride is responsible for an enormous amount of unnecessary conflict. Someone makes a small remark, and we feel that failing to answer means they have won. We imagine they will think we are weak. Maybe they will, but if their opinion has no meaningful effect on your life, why should proving strength to them become your responsibility? You do not need to answer every challenge to demonstrate that you are capable of answering challenges. Sometimes the ability to leave a minor insult unanswered is evidence that your sense of self is no longer dependent on winning every social exchange. At the same time, there is nothing noble about repeatedly tolerating behavior that damages you while calling it detachment. If someone at work is spreading false information about you, correct it appropriately. If someone consistently violates a clearly stated boundary, change what happens when the boundary is crossed. If an interaction becomes threatening or unsafe, prioritize distance and practical protection rather than trying to demonstrate philosophical calm. Stoicism should make you more capable of dealing with reality, not less willing to acknowledge it. There is another useful distinction here between responding to the person and responding to the situation. We often assume that if something needs action, we must confront the person directly. Not necessarily. Sometimes direct confrontation is useful. Other times the better response is procedural. You document what happened, you change an arrangement, you reduce access. You speak with someone responsible for the environment. You make a decision quietly. This can be much more effective than trying to teach a difficult person a lesson. Imagine someone repeatedly takes credit for your work. You could confront them angrily every time, but perhaps the more effective response is to make your contributions visible through clearer documentation and communication. Now you are solving the practical vulnerability instead of waiting for the person to develop better character. This is deeply compatible with Stoic thinking because it directs effort toward what can actually be influenced. You may not be able to make someone honest. You may be able to make dishonesty less effective. You may not be able to make someone respectful. You may be able to determine what happens when disrespect crosses a certain line. That is a more grounded form of power. And once you begin thinking this way, you stop measuring emotional control by how much you can tolerate. Endurance is not automatically wisdom. Sometimes wisdom is staying. Sometimes it is speaking. Sometimes it is leaving. The same outward behavior can even come from completely different inner motives. Silence may come from confidence or fear. Confrontation may come from courage or ego. Walking away may be avoidance or excellent judgment. The action alone does not tell you which one it is. You have to know why you are doing it and what you expect the action to accomplish. This is where self-honesty becomes essential. If you tell yourself, "This isn't worth responding to," but then spend the next 3 days thinking about it, perhaps something remains unresolved. Maybe you need to examine why it affected you, or perhaps a boundary genuinely needs to be addressed. On the other hand, if you tell yourself, "I have to stand up for myself," but what you really want is to humiliate the person who embarrassed you, that deserves examination too. The aim is not to find a universal rule. It is to become accurate enough that your response fits the event. A small provocation gets a small amount of attention. A meaningful problem gets meaningful action. A dangerous situation gets protection. And none of them automatically gets control over your character. Once that distinction becomes clearer, boundaries also become simpler. You no longer need to turn every uncomfortable moment into a speech about respect. When something genuinely crosses the line, you can state what needs to change, decide what you will do if it continues, and stop trying to persuade the other person to agree that your boundary is reasonable. That is where the next part becomes important, because a strong boundary usually needs far fewer words than we think. There is a point in some difficult interactions where understanding is no longer the main problem. The person already knows you dislike the behavior. You may have explained it before, perhaps more than once. They know that the comment bothers you, that the subject is private, that you do not want to be spoken to in a certain way, or that you are not willing to participate in a particular kind of conversation. And yet when the behavior happens again, we often respond by explaining the boundary from the beginning, as though the missing ingredient were a better argument. We describe how the behavior makes us feel, remind them of previous conversations, explain why the limit is reasonable, and sometimes defend our right to have the limit at all. What should have been a boundary gradually becomes a negotiation. This is where it helps to understand that a boundary and an explanation are not the same thing. An explanation tells another person why something matters to you. That can be valuable in healthy relationships because people who care about us often want to understand our experience. A boundary does something different. It defines what you will participate in and, when necessary, what you will do when a particular line is crossed. The first depends partly on understanding. The second depends primarily on your behavior. Suppose someone repeatedly raises their voice at you during disagreements. You may have already told them that shouting makes productive conversation impossible. If it happens again, you do not necessarily need another 10-minute discussion about respectful communication. You can say, "I'm willing to talk about this when we can do it without shouting." If they continue, you end the conversation. The important part is not the elegance of the sentence. The important part is that your action matches it. This can feel uncomfortable because we often want the other person to agree that our boundary is justified before we enforce it. We explain because we are searching for permission. If they understand why we need the limit, perhaps they will accept it, and then we will not have to experience the discomfort of disappointing them. But difficult people may never provide that permission. In fact, someone who benefits from the absence of your boundary has very little incentive to tell you that the boundary is reasonable. You may have to tolerate their disagreement. That is one of the less glamorous parts of self-respect. A person can think your boundary is unnecessary and still encounter it. They can think you are overreacting and still discover that the conversation ends when insults begin. They can dislike the fact that you no longer discuss certain subjects and still receive no information about them. Their agreement is not what makes the boundary real. Your consistency does. This is where many boundaries fail. We state them strongly when we are angry and then abandon them when the emotional intensity passes. Someone crosses the line, we deliver a long speech, and for a few days everything changes. Then the person tests the limit again. We are tired, the timing is inconvenient, or we do not want another argument, so we allow the behavior. A week later it happens again, and eventually frustration accumulates until we explode. From inside our own experience, the explosion feels like a response to months of disrespect. From the other person's perspective, the rules may have looked inconsistent. Sometimes the behavior was tolerated, sometimes it produced anger, sometimes it produced nothing. A quieter boundary practiced consistently is usually much clearer. If you have decided that you will not discuss your finances with a certain relative, then you simply stop discussing them. They ask, and you say, "I'm keeping that private." They push, and you do not produce a more elaborate explanation. They accuse you of becoming secretive, and you allow them to have that interpretation. The boundary is not a project you need to complete together. This does not mean refusing all conversation about boundaries. In relationships that matter, it may be worth explaining yourself carefully. If someone you love unknowingly does something that hurts you, simply changing your behavior without communicating can create unnecessary confusion. The goal is not to turn emotional maturity into silence. The question is whether explanation is still serving understanding or has become an attempt to make another person approve of your limit. That distinction becomes clearer when you notice repetition. The first conversation may require explanation. The fifth usually requires behavior. There is also a subtle temptation to use boundaries as punishment. Someone hurts you, so you decide to withdraw access in a way designed to make them feel your absence. You stop responding because you want them to panic. You become cold because you want them to understand what they lost. You call this a boundary, but emotionally you are still trying to control their reaction. A real boundary does not require the other person to suffer in order to work. You reduce contact because contact is unhealthy for you, not because you need them to miss you. You leave a disrespectful conversation because continuing it is pointless, not because you want to demonstrate dominance. You keep something private because the person has not handled information responsibly, not because secrecy gives you leverage over them. The external behavior may look similar, but the internal purpose is completely different. Stoicism repeatedly brings us back to this question of purpose. What belongs to you? Your choices, your conduct, your participation. What does not fully belong to you? Whether the other person understands, approves, apologizes, becomes embarrassed, or finally recognizes that you were right. A boundary becomes cleaner when you remove those external goals from it. You decide what you will do, then you do it. There is another reason shorter boundaries are often more effective. Long explanations create more points of negotiation. Imagine telling someone, "I really don't want to discuss this because every time we talk about it I feel judged, and I've been under a lot of pressure lately, and I just think it would be better if we avoided the subject." A reasonable person may hear that and respect it. A difficult person may hear several openings. "I'm not judging you. You're too sensitive. What pressure? I was only asking. Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" Now you are defending the explanation instead of maintaining the boundary. "I'd rather not discuss" that contains much less material to debate. Again, there is nothing magical about the phrase. The power comes from your willingness to stop after saying enough. And that willingness grows when you become more comfortable with another person's temporary discomfort. They may become annoyed when the old pattern stops working. They may push harder at first. They may tell you that you have changed. Perhaps you have. You have changed your participation. That does not require hostility toward them. You can remain warm where warmth is appropriate. You can still care about the person. You can still understand why they are frustrated. Compassion does not require reopening every door you decided needed to close. This is where boundaries become less dramatic and more integrated into ordinary behavior. You no longer think of yourself as constantly setting boundaries. You simply know what you participate in. The limit becomes part of how you live, rather than something you repeatedly announce. And once that happens, provocation loses another route into you. The person can still dislike the limit, they can criticize it, they can test it, but they cannot automatically convert their frustration into your surrender. There is, however, another test that often appears at exactly this point. When someone repeatedly violates a boundary, anger can begin telling us that calmness is no longer enough. We start wanting them to feel what they have made us feel. If they embarrassed us, we want to embarrass them. If they were cruel, cruelty begins to feel justified. If they provoked us intentionally, we want to show them that we can provoke them too. And that is where another person's behavior can begin changing our character, even after we have learned how to protect our boundaries. There is a moment in some conflicts when simply protecting yourself stops feeling satisfying. You have stayed calm, explained what needed to be explained, perhaps even set a clear boundary, and the other person still continues. They make another sarcastic remark. They distort what you said. They embarrass you in front of someone else, or deliberately touch the same nerve they already know is sensitive. At that point, a different impulse can appear. You no longer want only to stop the behavior. You want them to feel something. You want them to experience the embarrassment they caused you, the frustration they created, or the uncertainty they left you carrying. And because they started it, retaliation can feel strangely reasonable. You tell yourself that perhaps this is the only language they understand. The problem is that retaliation changes the question. Until that moment, you were deciding how to respond to their behavior. Now you are deciding how much of their behavior you are willing to reproduce. They insulted you, so you search for an insult that will hurt more. They exposed something personal, so you remember something personal about them. They mocked you in front of other people, so you wait for an opportunity to embarrass them publicly. The mind can become remarkably creative once revenge feels justified, and because the other person behaved badly first, almost anything you do afterward can begin feeling like self-defense. But there is an important difference between stopping someone and punishing them. If someone is disrespectful, you can end the conversation. If they violate a boundary, you can change their access to you. If their behavior creates practical harm, you can take appropriate action. Those responses are directed toward the problem. Punishment has another purpose. You want the person to suffer enough to understand what they did to you. That desire is human. Pretending otherwise does not make us wiser. When someone humiliates us, part of us may genuinely enjoy imagining the moment when the roles reverse. The Stoic challenge is not to deny that impulse, but to examine where it leads. Seneca wrote extensively about anger because he understood how easily the desire for justice can become the desire for revenge. Once anger becomes interested in making another person hurt, it can continue long after the original threat has passed. And retaliation has a particular psychological appeal because it promises restoration. You felt powerless for a moment, and now hurting them back seems capable of restoring the balance. They made you feel small, now you will make them feel small. They disturbed your peace, now they should lose theirs. There is a primitive symmetry to it that feels fair. The difficulty is that emotional symmetry rarely produces resolution. It usually produces another round. You embarrass them, and now they have a new injury to answer. They insult you again, and now your next response feels justified. Before long, neither person is reacting to the original event. Each is reacting to the latest retaliation from the other. The conflict becomes self-sustaining. This is how people can spend years fighting over something neither of them can clearly identify anymore. Families do this, co-workers do this, friends do this. Entire relationships can become organized around keeping an invisible score. Who apologized last? Who ignored whom? Who said the crueler thing? Who reached out first? Who deserves to suffer a little longer? At some point, protecting yourself requires refusing to keep the score. That does not mean forgiving everything immediately or continuing a relationship that repeatedly harms you. Refusing retaliation and maintaining consequences are completely compatible. You can decide that someone no longer gets the same access to you without trying to make them regret losing it. You can report inappropriate behavior at work without turning the process into a personal campaign against the person. You can correct a lie without inventing one about them. The distinction is purpose. Are you trying to protect something, correct something, or stop something? Or are you trying to make them hurt? Being honest about that motive matters because revenge can disguise itself as strength. We sometimes admire the person who always has a devastating comeback, who never lets an insult go unanswered, who can immediately identify another person's insecurity and use it against them. But there is a strange dependence hidden inside that behavior. If your cruelty appears only because someone else was cruel first, they still determined what kind of person you became in the interaction. That is not independence. It is imitation with justification. The Stoic position is harder because it asks you to maintain standards precisely when violating them would feel most satisfying. It is easy to believe in restraint around reasonable people. The test appears when someone gives you a convincing excuse not to have any. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that another person's wrongdoing could not force him to participate in the same kind of wrongdoing. The idea is easy to turn into a moral slogan, but it becomes more interesting when you apply it practically. If someone behaves dishonestly, your goal is not merely to avoid dishonesty because honesty is noble. It is also because adopting their methods pulls you into a game they may understand better than you do. A manipulative person may be far more comfortable with manipulation than you are. A chronically aggressive person may have spent years practicing aggression. Trying to defeat them by becoming better at their own behavior is an odd strategy. You have other options. You can become harder to manipulate because you recognize the pattern earlier. You can become harder to provoke because you no longer answer during the first emotional surge. You can make your boundaries more consistent. You can document facts. You can leave conversations. You can reduce access. You can decide that some relationships are not worth maintaining. None of those require you to become more toxic than the toxic person. There is another cost to retaliation that often appears later, when the emotional intensity has passed. You may win the moment and then dislike the memory of how you behaved. Perhaps you said something true but unnecessarily cruel. Maybe you exposed a weakness someone trusted you with because you knew it would hurt. The other person may have deserved confrontation, but afterward you realize you crossed your own line. That regret is different from regretting that you defended yourself. It comes from recognizing that someone else's behavior temporarily persuaded you to abandon your own standard. This is why emotional control cannot be measured only by whether you won the interaction. A better measure is whether you still respect your behavior when you examine it later without the adrenaline. Could you defend what you did without saying, "But they started it"? That is a useful test. Because they started it explains behavior. It does not automatically justify behavior. And this becomes especially important when you have something powerful you could use against the other person. Maybe you know exactly what insecurity to attack. Maybe you have private information. Maybe you could humiliate them in front of people whose opinions matter to them. Having the ability to hurt someone and deciding that the situation does not require it is a much more demanding form of restraint than simply having no weapon available. You are not protecting them from every consequence. You are protecting yourself from becoming careless with your own character. That distinction can also make confrontation cleaner. When revenge is removed from the equation, you can become surprisingly direct. You do not need to soften a necessary boundary because you are afraid of appearing angry, and you do not need to exaggerate the boundary because you want to punish them. You simply deal with the behavior. This conversation is over. That was inappropriate. I'm not comfortable continuing this relationship in the same way. I've documented what happened and I'm taking it through the proper process. The action can be serious without becoming vindictive. And once you stop trying to punish provocation with more provocation, something else becomes available that often feels uncomfortable at first: silence. Not silence as a performance, not the silent treatment, and not a technique designed to make someone chase you. Just the willingness to let an awkward moment remain awkward without rushing to rescue it with another sentence. Because sometimes the person who made the provocative comment expects you to do all the work that follows. They throw something into the room, then wait for you to defend, explain, laugh nervously, or retaliate. You do not always have to give them that relief. Sometimes you can simply let the words sit where they were placed. Silence becomes uncomfortable very quickly when tension enters a conversation. Someone says something insulting, intrusive, sarcastic, or deliberately provocative, and almost immediately we feel pressure to do something with the moment. We answer. We laugh awkwardly. We explain ourselves. We ask what they meant even when their meaning is already obvious. Sometimes we change the subject just to remove the tension from the room. It can happen so automatically that we barely notice what we are doing. The other person created the discomfort, but we become responsible for resolving it. That is worth noticing because not every silence needs to be rescued. Imagine someone makes a disrespectful joke about you in front of several people. Everyone hears it. Perhaps one or two people give the uncomfortable half-smile people use when they are not sure whether they are supposed to laugh. Your instinct may be to smile too, because smiling reduces the social tension. Or perhaps you immediately produce a comeback because silence feels as though you have been defeated. But there is another possibility. You simply look at the person for a moment and say nothing. Now something interesting happens. The comment remains where they placed it. You have not accepted it. You have not fought it. You have not helped transform it into harmless humor by laughing. The person who made the remark may suddenly become aware of the weight of their own words because you have refused to carry that weight for them. This is different from using silence as punishment. The silent treatment is often an attempt to control someone through withdrawal. You refuse communication because you want them to become anxious, guilty, or desperate enough to pursue you. That is still a form of emotional manipulation. The silence we are talking about here has a much simpler purpose. There is nothing useful to say yet, so you do not speak merely because the moment feels uncomfortable. That distinction matters. You are not thinking, "I'm going to make them uncomfortable now." You are thinking, "I don't need to solve the discomfort they created." The difference may be invisible from the outside, but internally it changes everything. Many of us have developed a strong habit of filling conversational space. Silence makes us wonder what the other person is thinking. We worry that we look confused, weak, offended, or socially awkward. So we speak quickly, sometimes before we even know what we want to say. And people who are comfortable creating tension can benefit from this because they know you will rush to relieve it. An intrusive question is a simple example. Someone asks something deeply personal that they have no real reason to know. You feel surprised, and before you have decided whether you want to answer, you are already answering because the question seems to demand a response. But questions do not create obligations merely because they have question marks. You can pause. You can decide whether the person actually needs that information. You can ask, "Why do you ask?" Or you can simply say, "I'd rather keep that private." The small silence before the response gives you time to remember that you still have a choice. The same principle applies when someone makes an accusation designed to force immediate defense. "So I guess you think you're better than everyone now." There is a temptation to answer instantly, "No, of course I don't think that." But perhaps you allow a few seconds to pass and ask yourself what exactly requires correction. Sometimes the accusation becomes noticeably weaker when it is not met by immediate panic. This is one reason silence can change the rhythm of provocation. Provocation often depends on speed. Someone throws something at you verbally and expects something to come back. They are prepared for your defense, your anger, your denial, perhaps even your insult. When nothing comes back immediately, the rhythm breaks. And in that break, you gain information. Does the person clarify what they meant? Do they become uncomfortable and soften the comment? Do they repeat it more aggressively because they are trying harder to get the reaction? Do they suddenly say, "I'm only joking"? What happens after your silence can tell you more about the interaction than your immediate response would have. But silence should not become a trick that you perform in every disagreement. If someone asks a sincere question, answer it. If a person you care about tells you that something you did hurt them, staring silently at them in the name of Stoicism is not emotional control. It may simply be avoidance. If an accusation has serious consequences and needs to be corrected, correct it. The value of silence comes from selectivity. It is useful when words would only reward provocation, when you need a moment to think, when the statement does not deserve a response, or when another person needs to take responsibility for what they just introduced into the conversation. This is also why silence can be particularly effective after you have already said something clearly. You tell someone, "I'm not discussing that." They ask again. You repeat yourself. Then they ask a third time. At some point, another explanation weakens rather than strengthens the boundary. You have already communicated. Now silence can simply mean the conversation on that subject has ended. This can feel almost rude if you are accustomed to making sure everyone understands you. But there is a difference between being rude and refusing repetition. You are not required to produce endless variations of the same answer until the other person finds one they enjoy. And this is where the previous points begin to reinforce each other. When you stop trying to win the exchange, you no longer need the last word. When you stop defending yourself against every accusation, silence no longer feels like confession. When your boundary does not depend on the other person's agreement, you no longer need to keep explaining it. Silence becomes possible because you have stopped assigning speech jobs that speech cannot actually perform. You cannot talk someone into respecting a boundary they have decided to ignore. You cannot explain yourself into controlling their interpretation. You cannot produce a sentence that guarantees they will leave the interaction thinking well of you. Once you accept those limits, silence stops feeling empty. It becomes simply one of several available responses. There is also something valuable about learning to tolerate the physical discomfort of silence itself. You may feel your heart beating while nobody speaks. You may notice the urge to smile, soften what you said, or add, "I don't mean that in a bad way." Stay with that urge for a moment. You do not have to obey it. Sometimes we weaken perfectly reasonable statements because we cannot tolerate the few seconds that follow them. "No, I can't do that." Silence, and then anxiety appears. "So, maybe if things change, or I could possibly see if..." The boundary begins disappearing because the silence felt harder to tolerate than the request. Learning to leave the sentence alone can change the way you communicate. "No, I can't do that." And then you allow the other person to have whatever reaction belongs to them. They may be disappointed, they may become irritated, they may need a moment. Not every uncomfortable reaction is evidence that you communicated badly. That realization can make you much less vulnerable to provocation because people can no longer rely on discomfort alone to make you speak, explain, retreat, or surrender. But there is a limit to what silence can accomplish. Some conversations do not improve when you stop feeding them. The other person keeps pushing. They ignore the boundary. They continue insulting, shouting, circling back, or trying to restart an argument you have already finished. At that point, remaining physically present may become another form of participation. And sometimes the calmest thing you can do is stop trying to improve the conversation and recognize that the conversation itself is over. One of the hardest things to recognize in a conflict is the moment when there is no longer a useful conversation happening. We tend to assume that because two people are still speaking, communication is still taking place. So we remain there, answering the next accusation, correcting the next distortion, returning to the point for the fourth or fifth time, hoping that one more explanation will finally change the direction of the exchange. Sometimes it does. People can become defensive and then settle down. Misunderstandings can take time to untangle. A difficult conversation is not automatically a useless conversation simply because it becomes uncomfortable, but there is a point where discomfort is no longer serving understanding, because neither person is actually moving toward anything. The conversation has become a loop, and continuing it is simply another way of remaining inside the provocation. You can usually recognize that shift by watching what happens to the subject. Perhaps you started with one concrete disagreement, but now you are arguing about the way you answered the disagreement. Then you begin arguing about the tone used while arguing about the way you answered it. Old grievances appear, motives are assigned. Words from 10 minutes earlier are reconstructed and debated. You clarify something, but the clarification does not reduce confusion. It creates another accusation. At some point you may realize that if you solved the original issue perfectly, the argument would continue anyway, because the original issue is no longer what is keeping the interaction alive. This is where many of us remain too long because leaving feels like losing. We imagine the other person saying, "See, you're walking away because you know I'm right." Perhaps they actually say it, and now the sentence is almost perfectly designed to pull you back into the room. You turn around because you want to prove that you are not afraid of the conversation, and within seconds the argument has restarted. But if someone can keep you in a useless conversation merely by accusing you of avoiding it, then they still control whether you are allowed to leave. There is an important distinction between avoiding difficult conversations and ending unproductive ones. Avoidance happens when there is something important that needs to be addressed, and we refuse to face it because it makes us uncomfortable. Leaving becomes appropriate when the necessary issue has already been addressed, or when the conditions required for a useful discussion no longer exist. The difference is not whether the conversation feels unpleasant. Many worthwhile conversations feel unpleasant. The difference is whether staying is still capable of producing anything constructive. Ask yourself what new information is being exchanged. Are either of you still listening? Is the disagreement becoming more specific or more chaotic? Are you discussing behavior or attacking identity? Could anything you say realistically change what happens next? If you notice that you are repeating sentences you already said 15 minutes ago, that is often a sign worth taking seriously. Sometimes the most mature response is simply, "We're repeating ourselves. I'm going to stop here." That sentence does not guarantee the other person will agree. They may insist that you stay. They may accuse you of being immature, cowardly, manipulative, or disrespectful. But ending a conversation does not require a unanimous vote. This connects directly to boundaries. A boundary is not only about which subjects you discuss or how you allow someone to speak to you. It can also concern how long you remain in an interaction after it stops being productive. You are allowed to recognize diminishing returns, and the ability to leave becomes particularly important with provocation because some people become more effective the longer the interaction continues. They may not be able to unsettle you with the first comment, so they try another, then another. They move from the subject to your personality, from your personality to your past, from your past to someone else's opinion of you. If you believe you must answer everything before you are allowed to leave, they can keep generating reasons for you to remain indefinitely. You do not need to finish every branch of an argument. You can leave questions unanswered. You can allow an accusation to remain uncorrected when it has no meaningful consequence. You can recognize that another person is not satisfied with the ending and still let the interaction end. That can feel deeply unnatural when you care about being understood. You walk away and immediately begin imagining what they are thinking. Perhaps they now believe you had no answer. Perhaps they will tell someone else a distorted version of what happened. Perhaps you think of the perfect sentence 5 minutes later and feel tempted to return, send a message, or reopen the conversation. This is where leaving physically and leaving psychologically become two different skills. You can walk out of the room and still remain completely trapped in the exchange. You replay their words while driving home. You construct better answers in the shower. You imagine another version of the argument where you finally say everything correctly and they have no response. You tell yourself you are processing what happened, but sometimes you are simply continuing the conversation without the other person present. That is why leaving should not be understood as a dramatic act. You do not need to slam the door or deliver a final sentence designed to haunt them. Those actions often reveal that you are still trying to win. A clean exit can be almost boring. "I don't think this is going anywhere. We can talk about it later if we're both calmer. I've said what I needed to say. I'm going to leave now." Then you leave. The simplicity can feel unsatisfying because there is no emotional climax. But perhaps that is exactly what makes it useful. You are not trying to create a memorable ending. You are trying to stop spending time on something that no longer deserves it. Of course, there are contexts where simply walking away is not immediately possible. You may be in a work meeting, dealing with a customer, sitting in a family gathering, or speaking with someone who has legitimate authority over part of the situation. Emotional control has to function inside reality. In those cases, leaving may mean narrowing the conversation rather than physically departing. You return to the agenda. You say, "I'm happy to discuss the work, but I'm not discussing personal comments." You defer the conversation until a more appropriate setting. You reduce your participation to what the role actually requires. The principle remains the same. You stop feeding the part of the interaction that has no useful destination. This is also where Stoicism becomes much more practical than the stereotype of silently enduring everything. The Stoics cared intensely about the use of time and attention. Seneca, in particular, treated time as something far more precious than most of us behave as though it is. Yet we can give 40 minutes to an argument we knew was pointless after the first 10, then give another 2 hours to replaying it afterward. The cost is larger than the argument itself. It is the work you did not focus on, the conversation with someone else that you were mentally absent from, the evening that remained tense because you carried the interaction into another room, the sleep disturbed by imaginary replies. When viewed that way, leaving an unproductive conversation is not simply conflict management, it is attention management. You are deciding what deserves more of your finite life. And sometimes the most difficult person to convince that the conversation is finished is not the person standing in front of you. It is yourself. The interaction ends, but the nervous system is still activated. The mind still wants resolution. It keeps returning to the insult because unfinished social conflict feels important. This is where the next stage becomes necessary. You can learn to recognize bait, pause, control your tone, use fewer words, set boundaries, and walk away at the right moment. But if you spend the rest of the day continuing the argument internally, the person still occupies far more of your life than the actual encounter required. So after learning how to leave the conversation, we have to learn how to stop carrying it with us. Sometimes the most exhausting part of an argument begins after the other person is gone. The room becomes quiet, the conversation is technically over, and nothing more is happening in the outside world, yet the interaction continues with remarkable clarity inside your mind. You hear the exact sentence again, you remember their expression, you reconstruct your answer and notice what you should have said differently. Then you imagine another version of the conversation in which you respond perfectly. You see them becoming quiet because this time you found the sentence they could not answer. For a moment that imaginary victory feels satisfying, but then the mind returns to what actually happened and the irritation begins again. The person may be somewhere else living their day normally while you are still having a conversation with a mental version of them. This is where provocation can become far more expensive than the original event. Someone may have taken 30 seconds of your time in reality and then received 3 hours of your attention afterward. They are not actively doing anything to you during those 3 hours. The event is being maintained internally through memory, interpretation, and rehearsal. That does not mean you chose to think about it. Intrusive replay can happen automatically, especially when an interaction felt threatening, humiliating, or unresolved. The important distinction is between the thought returning and what you do once you notice that it has returned. The mind has reasons for replaying social conflict. It is trying, in part, to learn. If something went badly, reviewing it may help us respond better in the future. We do this after job interviews, difficult conversations, awkward social moments, and mistakes. Some reflection is useful. You may realize that you became defensive too quickly, failed to set a boundary, misunderstood something, or stayed in the conversation too long. That information can improve your behavior next time. The problem begins when reflection stops producing new information and becomes repetition. You can usually feel the difference. Reflection moves somewhere. Rumination circles. Reflection asks, what happened and what can I learn from it? Rumination keeps asking, how could they have said that to me? One produces a decision, the other produces another round of emotion. This is why telling yourself to stop thinking about it rarely works. The instruction creates another struggle. Now you are thinking about the person and criticizing yourself for thinking about the person. A more useful approach is to give the mind what it is legitimately looking for, and then notice when it begins repeating itself. Perhaps you ask 3 simple questions after a difficult interaction. What actually happened? Was there anything I should have done differently? Is there anything I need to do now? Maybe the answer is that you should apologize for something you said. Then apologize. Maybe someone crossed a boundary that needs to be addressed tomorrow. Decide how you will address it. Maybe a workplace incident needs to be documented. Document it. Maybe you handled the situation reasonably and there is nothing left to do. That last answer can be surprisingly difficult to accept because the emotional system may still want action even when no useful action exists. This is where Stoic thinking becomes especially relevant. The Stoics repeatedly distinguished between the event itself and the judgments we continue adding to it. That distinction is sometimes misunderstood as though they believed painful events do not matter. They did. The point was that the mind can continue multiplying an event long after reality has stopped producing new information. Someone insulted you once. Memory can allow them to insult you 50 times. Someone embarrassed you for 20 seconds. Imagination can reconstruct the embarrassment every night for a week. The original event belongs to the past. The repetitions are occurring now. And each repetition can produce a fresh physical response. Your body does not always care that the argument is imaginary. You can be sitting alone in a quiet room and feel your jaw tighten because you remembered the tone they used. Your heart rate can rise while you imagine what you would say if the conversation happened again. In a very real sense, you can repeatedly reactivate an encounter that no longer exists. That is why protecting your peace after provocation requires more than physically leaving the person. You have to become careful about what you repeatedly rehearse. This does not mean forcing yourself to forget. Some interactions need time to settle. If someone you trusted betrayed you, if a colleague seriously undermined you, or if a relationship revealed something painful, the mind may return to it because the event genuinely matters. There is a difference between allowing yourself to process something significant and turning every rude comment into a psychological investigation. Proportion matters here, just as it mattered when deciding whether to respond. A small event should not automatically receive a large portion of your inner life. Consider how often we allow a 5-second interaction with a stranger to contaminate an entire afternoon. Someone cuts in front of us, speaks rudely, or makes an unnecessary comment. 20 minutes later we are telling another person about it. 2 hours later we remember it again. By evening, this stranger has occupied more mental space than several people we actually care about. There is something disproportionate about that. And once you notice the disproportion, you can begin redirecting attention without pretending the event never happened. You might simply name what is happening. I'm having the argument again. That is different from I'm solving the argument. The first description is often more accurate. Then return to whatever deserves your attention now. The work in front of you, the person sitting beside you, the meal you are eating, the walk you are taking. This sounds almost too simple, but attention is rarely reclaimed through one dramatic act. It is reclaimed repeatedly, each time the mind tries to reopen a conversation that has already given you all the useful information it contains. Sometimes the replay is driven by the need to repair your image of yourself. You are not only thinking about what the person said, You are thinking about the fact that you did not respond the way you wish you had. Perhaps you froze. Perhaps your voice shook. Perhaps you thought of the right answer later. This can produce a peculiar kind of shame because we imagine there was a perfect version of ourselves available in that moment, and we failed to become it. But real interactions are messy. You do not have a script. You are processing tone, context, emotion, and social pressure in real time. Sometimes you will handle things poorly. The useful response is to learn what you can and become slightly better prepared for the next situation, not to repeatedly punish yourself with an edited version of the past. The perfect comeback you invented 2 hours later was created by a calm brain with unlimited time. The person standing in the actual conversation did not have those conditions. Give that person some reasonable allowance. And there is another reason to stop replaying provocation. Repetition can train sensitivity. If you repeatedly revisit every insult, analyze every expression, and search for hidden meanings, you teach your attention that these events are extremely important. You become better at noticing them. Eventually, you may enter interactions already scanning for disrespect. Then emotional control becomes harder because the mind has been trained to treat minor social threats as major events. The opposite training is possible. You can notice disrespect without worshipping it with attention. You can address what requires action and release what does not. You can allow another person to have behaved badly without turning their behavior into the central event of your day. That is not indifference, it is proportion. And this is where everything we have discussed begins moving towards something larger than techniques for individual confrontations. The ultimate goal cannot be to carry around 15 rules and mentally search for the correct one every time someone irritates you. Eventually, these practices have to become part of your temperament. You recognize bait sooner. You pause more naturally. You no longer explain yourself automatically. Your boundaries require less drama. You recover faster. The person may still provoke you. The difference is that there is less inside you available for them to control. And that brings us to the final part, because the deepest form of emotional control is not learning how to win against provocative people. It is becoming someone who is increasingly difficult to bait in the first place. Eventually, all of these techniques have to become less visible. You cannot realistically move through life carrying a mental checklist every time someone irritates you, remembering to pause, control your voice, ask for clarification, use fewer words, avoid defending yourself, set a boundary, tolerate the silence, and decide whether to leave. Those things are useful while you are learning because they make the process visible, but the deeper goal is for them to gradually become part of the way you respond. You begin recognizing certain patterns earlier. You notice the first physical signs of anger sooner. You become less frightened by silence, less desperate to correct someone's opinion of you, and less interested in winning conversations that have nothing meaningful to offer. Provocation still reaches you, but it has fewer places to attach itself. This is an important distinction because becoming difficult to provoke does not mean becoming impossible to hurt. There is a version of emotional control that sounds impressive, but is not particularly human. Nothing bothers you. Nobody gets under your skin. Criticism means nothing. Rejection means nothing. Insult means nothing. That is not the standard we need. If someone you love deliberately says something cruel, it may hurt. If a colleague publicly questions your integrity, you may feel angry. If someone humiliates you, your body may react before you have time to organize your thoughts. Emotional maturity is not demonstrated by the absence of those reactions. It is demonstrated by how little unnecessary behavior they are allowed to produce. That is why the word unbothered can sometimes mislead us. We imagine strength as a state in which the nervous system becomes completely still. But perhaps the more useful goal is not to become unbothered. It is to become less governable by being bothered. You can feel anger without giving anger complete authority over your mouth. You can feel embarrassed without allowing embarrassment to choose your next decision. You can know that someone dislikes you without turning their dislike into a project you must solve. This is much closer to what the Stoics meant by self-command. They were not trying to remove themselves from human experience. Marcus Aurelius dealt with betrayal, criticism, political conflict, illness, grief, and difficult personalities. Seneca wrote about anger precisely because anger was a real human problem, not because he had transcended it. Epictetus built much of his philosophy around the fact that external events constantly press against our preferences. Their question was not how to construct a world in which nothing disturbs us. It was how to stop handing the steering wheel to every disturbance that appears. And that requires knowing your own handles. Everyone has them. For one person, it is disrespect. A certain tone immediately produces anger. For another, it is being misunderstood. They can tolerate criticism, but they cannot tolerate someone believing something false about their motives. For someone else, it is rejection. The moment another person withdraws approval, they begin explaining, chasing, or changing themselves. Another person may be unusually sensitive to appearing unintelligent, weak, selfish, unsuccessful, or incompetent. There is nothing shameful about discovering these vulnerabilities. In fact, pretending they do not exist makes them easier to use against you. If you know that accusations of selfishness make you abandon reasonable boundaries, you can recognize the reaction when it appears. If you know public embarrassment makes you aggressive, you can prepare for the pressure before your behavior accelerates. Self-knowledge does not remove the button. It makes the button harder to press without you noticing. This is where difficult people can unintentionally become useful teachers. Not because we should seek toxic relationships or feel grateful for mistreatment, but because friction reveals parts of us that comfortable relationships may never expose. A patient person does not show you how you behave around impatience. Someone who respects your boundaries does not reveal how easily guilt can make you abandon them. A person who communicates honestly does not show you whether you become desperate when faced with manipulation. The difficult interaction reveals the unfinished work. You can resent that information, or you can use it. Suppose someone makes the same kind of comment that would once have occupied your mind for hours. You still notice it. Perhaps you even feel the familiar irritation begin. But this time you recognize what is happening. You do not immediately answer. You decide the comment does not require a response and continue with your day. 20 minutes later, you realize you have almost forgotten about it. That may not feel dramatic enough to count as growth, but it is. The event remained approximately the same. Your recovery time changed. And recovery time may be one of the clearest measures of emotional development. You do not need to reach a state where you never become angry. Perhaps you recover from anger in 20 minutes instead of 4 hours. You do not need to become immune to criticism. Perhaps you can examine criticism without carrying it into the next 3 conversations. You do not need to stop feeling embarrassed. Perhaps embarrassment no longer makes you spend the evening mentally rewriting the scene. Progress can look like shorter possession. The emotion arrives, stays for a while, gives you whatever information it contains, and leaves without rearranging the rest of your day. There is also a deeper form of security that develops when you stop needing every interaction to confirm your identity. If you need everyone to see you as intelligent, an accusation of stupidity becomes powerful. If you need everyone to see you as kind, being called selfish becomes dangerous. If you need everyone to respect you visibly, every small social slight becomes something you must correct. But when your sense of character comes increasingly from examining your own conduct, other people's interpretations become information rather than verdicts. Sometimes the information is valuable, sometimes it is wrong, sometimes it is deliberately cruel. You can evaluate it without immediately becoming it. This is not permission to become arrogant. There is a dangerous version of detachment where a person decides that everyone else's opinion is irrelevant and therefore never has to examine themselves. That is not Stoicism. If you consistently create conflict everywhere you go, the common denominator deserves investigation. If people you trust tell you that your behavior hurts them, emotional strength may require listening rather than dismissing them as toxic. The goal is not to stop caring what anyone thinks. It is to stop allowing any single person's opinion to bypass your judgment and become your identity automatically. That makes you both harder to manipulate and easier to correct. You can hear criticism without collapsing. You can admit fault without feeling defeated. You can reject an unfair accusation without spending an hour disproving it. You become more flexible because your ego has less to defend. And perhaps this is the paradox at the center of emotional control. The less obsessed you are with appearing strong, the stronger your responses tend to become. You do not need the devastating comeback. You do not need to dominate the room. You do not need to make someone regret provoking you. You need enough internal stability to decide what the moment actually requires. Sometimes that will be silence, sometimes a question, sometimes a clear boundary, sometimes an apology, sometimes leaving, and sometimes you will decide that the person in front of you deserves a serious response because what they are doing has real consequences. The behavior changes because the situation changes, but the source remains the same. You are choosing. That is the thread connecting everything we have explored. Someone can introduce anger into the interaction, but they cannot automatically decide what you do with it. They can misunderstand you without forcing you to explain yourself indefinitely. They can raise their voice without choosing yours. They can accuse you without placing you on trial. They can invite you into a useless argument without creating an obligation to stay. And when the interaction ends, they do not automatically receive the rest of your day. This does not make difficult people disappear. It does not guarantee that everyone will respect you. Some people may actually dislike the change because the old version of the relationship worked better for them. They may push harder for a while. They may accuse you of becoming cold, distant, arrogant, or different. You can examine those accusations honestly. Then you can continue according to what you find. Because becoming difficult to bait is not about becoming unreachable. It is about becoming less automatic. There is more space between what happens around you and what happens through you. And inside that space, you recover something provocation is always trying to take away: the ability to decide who you are going to be before someone else decides it for you. At some point, the real goal stops being to handle provocative people better and becomes something quieter, to stop letting them define the emotional shape of your day. Someone may still say the wrong thing. They may still try to embarrass you, question you, bait you, or push exactly where they know you are sensitive. None of that disappears simply because you understand Stoicism. What changes is the distance between what they do and what you become because of it. You begin to notice that distance more clearly. The insult lands, but it does not immediately become retaliation. The accusation appears, but it does not automatically become a defense. The silence feels uncomfortable, but you do not rush to fill it. You stop needing every exchange to end with agreement, every conflict to end with victory, every misunderstanding to be corrected before you can move on. And slowly, the other person loses access to something they may once have reached very easily: your automatic response. That does not make you passive, it makes you selective. You still speak when something matters. You still set boundaries. You still correct what needs correcting. You still leave when the conversation has become useless. But the difference is that your actions begin coming from judgment instead of emotional momentum. You are no longer reacting simply because someone found the right button. And maybe that is the most useful way to think about self-control. Not as becoming untouchable, but as becoming harder to move without your consent. You remain human. You still feel anger, embarrassment, disappointment, even hurt. But those emotions stop functioning like commands. They become signals you can examine, rather than instructions you must obey. The Stoics were not trying to build a life where nobody could provoke them. They were trying to become less dependent on other people behaving well before they could behave well themselves. That standard is more demanding, but it is also more realistic. You cannot control who walks into the room, what mood they bring, or what they decide to say. You can keep becoming more deliberate about what leaves the room with you. And that may be the point worth carrying forward. Someone can try to provoke you. They can even succeed in making you feel something. But feeling something is not the same as surrendering control. The space between those two things is where your freedom lives.